Welcome to the SQL Challenge, Create an Extended Events Trace. And if you liked this challenge and if folks want more extended events challenges, there's lots of different ways we can create extended events traces and leverage different kinds of targets. So it might be interesting to do more of these. For today's problem, our example is that we have an execution plan that was forced for a query using query store. And then after the plan was forced, an index that's used by the plan was disabled. And the same thing could happen if the index was dropped, but in this case, the index is disabled. Now, the plan is no longer being forced. Now, one of the cool things about query store is that this doesn't make the query just fail, but it does mean that something that we wanted to happen, some fix we had in place, hopefully a short-term fix, that fix is no longer working. Our challenge is to set up a trace using extended events to get more detail about what's happening. Now, you might wonder, why bother to do this? Because one cool thing about extended events in terms of plan forcing is that we can see from some dynamic views that this is not working, and even we get a description for why it isn't working. This screenshot shows that we can see the last force failure reason description is no index. In other words, an index for this is force plan. We see on that same row that is force plan is 1, an index that was being forced is no longer present. And that is great. That is very lightweight to see that this is happening, but still this trace may be useful because in this case, this is a very simple execution plan, but what if we had a really complex execution plan? Exactly which index does it refer to that has been changed in there? Maybe we have a great change management system and we can quickly see which index was changed yesterday. Maybe we don't. The trace is one thing that can simplify tracking that down. Also, what if we didn't have such a clear reason for it failing? There are many different things we can get for that last failure description. And one of them is even like, general failure, I don't really have a good message for this. There might be multiple situations where we needed more detail. So this is, I think, also a good way, if you haven't set up extended events traces before, to get your feet wet, your feet dirty, to wade on into extended events and test out setting up some traces. So we are now going to take a look at a demo of setting up the problem and then the solution. Cruising on over to SQL Server, I have the problem file, the challenge file open first here. And let's go ahead and go full screen on this one. First thing we do is restore the database. And the database that we're using is the 1.3 release of the Babby name sample database, which is totally free to download. You may just have to change some file locations for where you have extracted the backup file to and where you restore it to on your instance. I have already restored this, but what the heck, let's go ahead and run this again. After restore, we turn on query store, we make sure query store is on and that it's read write, and we're setting our database compatibility mode to 140. I'm running this on SQL Server 2017, but you could run this on SQL Server 2016. Now, this demo isn't going to work below 2016 because query store is a feature that's in SQL Server 2016 and higher or Azure SQL database, but the way you manage it in Azure SQL database is different. All right, we're going to use the database. I've restored it as Babby Names 2017, and we're going to create a procedure named dbo.freezeme, a poorly named procedure who is asking for its execution plan to be forced. What the query does isn't that important. The important thing is that we are going to create an index for it named ix here and then gone, also a poorly named index. This is very bad anti-patterns on the naming system here. The thing about this index, though, is it is very suitable for this query. We are indexing the total name count column. We are including 3 columns. This index covers this query nicely. I'm going to execute dbo.freezeme with a total name count limit of 30. And I'm going to go ahead and turn on actual execution plans here. And the main thing we want to do here is just to confirm that it used IX here and then gone. And sure enough, we see that our execution plan loved IX here and then gone. So if I freeze this plan and say, oh, you need to always use IX here and then gone, then I will have a way to then drop the index and create this failure scenario. To freeze this, I am going to run a bit of code here that looks at those query store views. And if I just run this first query here, I'm going to populate these variables. What I'm doing is I've created variables for the query ID and the plan ID. And I'm selecting out I just want to assign one value to this. I've only run it once after the database restore, right? I want the query ID and plan ID for dbo.freezeMe. I am then going to put those variables into SP query store force plan with the query ID and the plan ID. I could do this exact same thing if I open my instance in Object Explorer. I could do this exact same thing from the GUI if I wanted to. I am using the Babby Names 2017 database. It's important to be in the right database is one thing I've certainly learned through my career. And if I've enabled Query Store, I get this nice Query Store bucket in here. If I can find my query in these reports, I haven't really run hardly anything against this instance, this database. I just restored this database, right? And I ran this one query. Some system queries have run in the background. Management Studios issued some queries, but we can look through here, and I'm going to change this view to a chart view. I can see here, now that I switched this to chart view, it's easier to see that this top query here, query ID 2, is part of the object name freezeMe. This is the plan that we saw. So if I wanted to use the GUI to click force plan there, I could click force plan and say, I really want to do it. Let's go ahead and do it through the T-SQL and then just view our change in the GUI. I'll run this query here. It says I affected one row when I ran query store force plan. Now, if I refresh this view on dbo.freezeMe, I have, let's see if we can properly zoom to the right over here. It really doesn't want to zoom to the right side of my screen today. So we will perhaps not zoom. Let's see if we can zoom back out. We have a failed zoom scenario. But you can see the checkbox over here, that checkbox indicating it's forced. I also have the little word forced here on the plan as well. Full screen and zoom it. Not playing well together today for some reason, but that's all right. If I wanted to, once I forced a plan as well, there is a queries with forced plan report that I can open itself that just shows queries who have plans who've been forced. And here we have query ID 2 has forced plan ID is 3. And I can see the check mark again there. Now, let's break our forced plan. I no longer need my execution plans on for this. We have forced a plan that says you must use IX here and then gone. So I'm going to disable that index or accidentally type over my T-SQL. So I did that, and now I'm really going to disable that index. Now when I run dbo.freezeMe, this is what I was saying. This is one of my first questions about forcing plans in Query Store was what happens when I accidentally remove or break something that has been forced. And I think this is great. We don't get an error. We get results. But if I now turn my execution plans back on and look at what's happening, I mean, my index, when I disable a non-clustered index, essentially, the metadata is still there, but the index can't be used. I think of it as sort of a deflated balloon. You got to be really careful disabling indexes. By the way, if you disable a clustered index, that is the table itself, the table becomes unavailable. Don't ask me how I know. I'm just kidding. It wasn't me who did that. In this one case, it wasn't me who did that when I learned what happens when you disable a clustered index. But I'm sure if given enough time, I'm sure I would have done it. All right, so we now have this failing, and we can verify this like you saw in the screenshot. If I query my query store views, I see that I now have 2 plans for the same query. This is query ID 2. When I first ran it and I had that non-clustered index, that was plan ID 3, and it was a trivial plan. When SQL Server went to optimize that query, it was like, oh, there is a clear option here. I'm going for it, and I forced it. It is now failing to force that plan because the index is gone. I can also confirm this was the forced plan, the one who's doing that seek there, and I can see that I have another plan for this query. It can no longer use that index, so it had to come up with a new plan, which is plan ID 40. It is not forced, and if I look at the query plan there, sure enough, it is scanning the clustered index. Our challenge is to set up an extended events trace so we can get more, like which index is failing, right? Can you give me more details about no index, which index? When we set up the extended events trace, we want to reproduce the failure and then look at exactly what is it capturing and what detail is it giving us. Then we also want to collect, when we're setting up our trace, we want to collect the session ID, who's experiencing the failure, as well as the SQL text that is running that triggers the failure. Here is our set of queries to test for this. That is the problem. Now let's get on over and set up the solution here. Let's close out our problem. And once I have a forced plan that's failing here in the report, I still have that queries with forced plan report. My query, even though the forcing isn't working, my query still shows up in this report. I can see here is when it was using the forced plan. And if I highlight over here, we see plan forced is yes. Now that it's failing, it's plan ID 40 and forced is no. It would like to force the other plan, but it can't because a component of the forced plan is gone. So it doesn't disappear from that report.